All right, so are you worried about the possibility of OSHA showing up in your lobby for a surprise inspection and you're not sure exactly what to do or how to prepare for that possibility? If that sounds like you, don't feel bad because you're definitely not alone and you've come to the right place because I've put together this series of videos called How to Pass Your OSHA Inspection. And in this edition of the series, I'm going to talk about putting together your playbook. I'm going to talk about how to actually prepare for an OSHA inspection. So there are three critical key steps that you got to start working on now in order to prepare for that possibility and pass your inspection. Before getting into that, if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to our channel and hit that notifications bell so that you're notified every time that I upload new content 2 to 3 times per month that's going to talk about the most important and critical environmental health and safety compliance issues and regulations that impact small manufacturing and industrial companies. All right, so my name is Russell Carr, and as I've mentioned in previous editions of this series, I've helped many small manufacturing companies navigate the entire OSHA enforcement process from that first inspection through fixing violations and even fighting back and defending against citations and fines. And in this series, I'm going to share with you the most important things that I've learned through that process. So again, you can prepare for and pass your OSHA inspection. All right, so with that said, let's get started. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about how to put together your OSHA inspection playbook. So this is actually going to be a series of 3 videos, this being the first video where we're going to talk in detail about how to prepare for an OSHA inspection. All right, that's what we're going to talk about today. Then check back soon and we'll have 2 more videos. One, we'll talk about how to manage an inspection if it happens. And then number 2, what to do after an inspection. But let's start off here and focus on how to prepare for an inspection. This is going to be a very detailed process. Let me introduce you to the 4 major steps that we're going to talk about today and what you want to be working on. Number 1, if you haven't been doing this already, you want to begin inspecting your facility to identify and correct physical health and safety hazards. Again, I'll go into more detail about what that means and what that looks like and why it's so important. Then you want to go ahead and confirm the status of your safety program. Make sure it's complete. Make sure it's up to date. It has all the general industry OSHA standards. You're managing all the aspects. Again, I'll talk about what that looks like and what that means. Then you want to consolidate all your safety documents and records in one location so that if you get inspected and they start asking for these things, they're at the ready and you can hand them over immediately. And then finally, you want to develop a formal plan for managing the inspection process. You want to document that plan. So let's look at each one of these in detail. So again, if you're not doing this already, you want to begin conducting routine facility inspections to identify and correct all the physical health and safety hazards out there on your shop floor. Also keep in mind that the majority of OSHA violations have to do with these physical health and safety hazards. And that's because these are the hazards and the issues that pose the most imminent risk to employees. So, and also inspectors are very good at identifying them and citing them. So it's really important to begin the process of identifying these hazards and fixing these hazards. So I want to cover some of the more common physical hazards that you see at a manufacturing or industrial facility. There's obviously a lot more, but I want to cover some of the big ones here just so you know what I'm talking about in case you're not familiar with them. So machine guarding issues, real common. So if you have any exposed pinch points on any of your equipment, you've got to guard those pieces of equipment. Even if it's a new piece of equipment, a lot of companies make the mistake of believing that if it's new equipment, then it must already be guarded correctly. That's unfortunately not the case. In a lot of instances, you've got to inspect all of your equipment and guard all those pinch points and exposure points. Electrical hazards, these are very common. You want to be looking always for daisy chaining problems. You want to look for damaged electrical cords. You can't be, for example, powering a permanent piece of equipment with an extension cord. You've got to hardwire that. Those are just some examples. Blocked exits and panels, real common violation. So it's very common for a company to stack up, product or raw materials in front of an emergency exit. You can't do that. That's a serious violation. Also, electrical panels, you have to keep a 3-foot circle around the front of electrical panels. Very common violations. Also, PPE use by your employees. You got to make sure that your employees are wearing safety glasses, wearing gloves, whatever you specify that they have to wear. You got to make sure they're wearing it and provide that PPE use. Very common violations. Slips, trips, and falls. These are typically housekeeping issues where the floors are just not kept clean, and you get employees tripping and falling. Real common hazard out there. Then you want to spot check, for high noise areas. If you've never done that before, get a noise meter, or you can even get an app on your phone. If you have any areas that have more than 85 decibels, that's what we would call a suspect area that you might want to get a full 8-hour time-weighted average check on that to see if you have any noise areas that might trigger the need for engineering controls or even a hearing conservation program. So these, again, are just some common examples, but there are many more. And also keep in mind, that it's going to take time for you and your team, if you haven't been doing these inspections, to identify, the biggest hazards and fix them. You're not going to find them in one inspection. You have to do routine inspections, whether that's daily, weekly, monthly. And also, even after you've identified the big ones, they have a nasty way of popping up over and over again. So inspecting becomes, a never-ending process that you have to stay on top of. That's really important. If you're not doing that now, you've got to start doing that to prepare for an inspection. Then let's talk about, how do you confirm and update the status of your safety program. So while you're working on the inspections, it's a good idea to begin this process because again, it's very detailed. So let's walk through what this looks like. So you want to ensure that your program includes all the applicable OSHA, what are called General Industry 1910 standards. And I'm going to go through some of the most common ones here in a minute so you see what I'm talking about. Then you want to ensure that your company is managing all these individual OSHA standards. They all have aspects that you actually have to implement and manage at your company, and you want to be able to back that up with records. And I'll explain what that means. And then, again, you want to consolidate all your safety documents and records in one place for easy access. Whether they're hard copies or electronic copies, you got to consolidate everything so that they're not, scattered all over your company, which a lot of companies end up making that mistake. All right, so let's talk about the common OSHA general industry standards. They're called standards that apply to most manufacturing companies. Let me just cover some of the more common ones. Number one is hazard communication. So hazard communication is OSHA's hazardous chemical, hazardous substance standard. So just about every manufacturing company is going to have hazardous chemicals. If that's true, you got to build a HAZCOM program. It's called HAZCOM for short. Also keep in mind that if you do get inspected, even if it's a very narrow focused inspection like I talked about in another video, it's standard operating procedure. They're going to ask for your HAZCOM program, your written program, your employee training records, your safety data sheets, all the rest of it. Lockout, tagout. Just about every manufacturing and industrial company is going to have equipment and machinery with multiple energy sources that fall under the lockout, tagout standard. I'm going to give you an example here in a minute of what you need to have in place for lockout, tagout. Emergency action plan. This applies to just about every company out there. If you have an emergency, you got to have a plan to deal with it. You got to train your employees on that and do drills, chemical spills, fires, weather events. You've got to have an emergency action plan put together. Powered industrial trucks. This has to do with material handling equipment, especially forklifts. Every manufacturing company just about has a forklift. Confined spaces, you got to assess your facility to see if you have any confined spaces, and if so, you've got to have a program to deal with that. Personal protective equipment, every company has that requirement. Hearing conservation, again, if you have high noise areas like I mentioned before, if you can't engineer out those high noises, then you have to implement a hearing conservation program if you're exceeding the 85 decibels over a time-weighted average. Respiratory protection, similar. If you have any hazardous chemicals or substances that you expose your employees to, like silica, lead, any of the other heavy metals, solvents, there's all kinds of hazardous materials out there that if you exceed the exposure level, the permissible exposure level, and you can't engineer it out, again, you're going to have to default to a respiratory protection program. So these are some of the most common ones that apply to manufacturing companies, but there are more. All right, so Then let's go ahead and dive in to make sure that your company is actually managing all of the standards that we just talked about. They all have aspects within those standards that you have to manage. And let me explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to use lockout, tagout as an example, like I mentioned before. So if you have the requirement for lockout, tagout, you have equipment with multiple energy sources, you have to have a written program, all right, that meets the requirements of the standard. And it's got to be customized to your company's specific requirements. It can't just be some generic thing that you downloaded off the internet. Then you have to have employee training, all right? So for lockout, tagout, there's two types of training that you have to have. Authorized training for the people who actually execute the lockout, tagout procedures, and effective training for everybody else so that they know what a lock and a tag means. Then you have to have an inventory or a list of all the equipment in your facility with multiple energy sources, all right? And then once you put that together, you have to develop equipment-specific lockout, tagout procedures for every one of those pieces of equipment. You can't just have one generic lockout, tagout procedure. You have to have one for each piece of equipment that falls under the standard. Then you have to do what's called an annual lockout, tagout audit or inspection, as the standard calls it, where you confirm that your authorized employees are actually following your lockout, tagout procedures. This is a very common violation because a lot of companies don't even know about the requirement. So again, these are what we call aspects. These are, things within the standard that you actually have to do. You can't just have a written program and meet the requirements. You actually have to do these things and manage these things. And a lot of companies just don't understand that. Also, like I mentioned before, you got to consolidate all your safety documents and records into one place. So what does that include? That includes all the written programs for each one of those standards that we talked about. Hazard communication, like I mentioned before, if you get inspected, they're going to ask for that. They're going to want the written program. They're going to want the employee training records, your safety data sheets. They're going to want to confirm that all your employees have direct access to those safety data sheets and so forth. Employee training records for all the different standards that we talked about, you have to have those at the ready, where you've got what's called a certification. All a certification is like a check-in sheet, a sign-off sheet that names, the standard that was trained, the date, and then all the employee signature or printed names and signatures. That's all you need to have, but you've got to have those ready to prove that you actually trained your employees in all the standards. Then you have to have your OSHA 300 log. So if you have 11 or more employees in any given calendar year, at any point during that year, you have to complete your OSHA 300 logs at the end of the year. They're going to ask for 5 years of records. So if you don't have that in place and you had more than 11 employees, you got to go back and you got to see if you had any recordable injuries, and if so, you've got to make note of those, calculate your TRIR and your DART scores, and finish your OSHA 300 logs. If you have the hearing conservation or respiratory protection programs that I referred to before, there are some critical records that you have to be able to present and consolidate and show to that inspector if they ask for them. Number one, your health exposure test results. So I referred to permissible exposure limits. So if you have high noise, you got to do an 8-hour test. You got to send that off to a lab. You got to have those test results. Same thing on the respiratory protection side. If you have exposures to any hazardous chemicals or substances, and they have PEL chemicals in there or substances, you have to test for that, and you have to send it off to a lab, and again, have proof of those test results. Also, if you have exceeded those limits, you can't engineer out those exposures, then you have to implement these hearing conservation and respiratory protection. And that requires these annual tests for your employees. So you do an initial audiogram, an initial respiratory evaluation, and you have to do annual tests on your employees to make sure that their performance and their exposures and their problems aren't getting worse. And you've got to keep up with that. Tough to do that, but you've got to do that if you have these programs in place. Then finally, last thing we want to talk about is developing a formal plan for managing your inspection. So let me explain what this looks like. And the first thing to understand here is that many companies fall into the trap of treating the inspection process too casually, which often results in more fines and penalties. You have to understand what the inspection process is, what's at stake, how to deal with the inspector, all those kind of things. If you treat it too casually, you're going to make a lot of mistakes and you're going to make it worse, and it's going to end up costing you a lot more money. That's why it's so important to develop that formal plan. So again, as I just mentioned, you've got to formally plan and prepare in order to minimize that potential damage. Don't fall into the trap of treating it too casually. And let's talk about what that plan is going to look like, what you need to include in that plan. So general preparation, you want to develop a written procedure. You want to assign a manager or managers, ideally your safety manager, to manage the inspection. If you don't have a full-time safety manager, then you want to assign the manager who is most familiar with your health and safety plan and documents and so forth. Then once you assign the manager to deal with this, or managers, you want to train them using that written procedure. So they already know, what's coming and what to expect and how to manage that inspection. Then you want to confirm, again, quick access to your safety documents and records. Again, I talked just a moment ago in detail about consolidating everything. It's really important that you have all that in one place. It doesn't matter if they're hard records or if they're electronic records. You have to have them at the ready. There's nothing worse than when an inspection happens, the inspector starts asking for all this and everyone's looking at each other, not knowing where it is, or maybe they're scattered all over the company. You've got to have everything ready in one place. That's got to be part of your preparation for the inspection. And then if you have a strong safety program, if you really do, then you want to create a safety policy. You want to have ownership or senior leadership sign it. Then you want to hang that policy throughout, in the lobby of the company and throughout the facility. So here's why that's so important. When you get inspected, the inspector is going to be looking for evidence of what's called management commitment. All right, so management commitment is top-down commitment from the senior leadership of the company to a safety program. If you actually have that, and you know that you have that, and you got a strong functioning safety program, you need to develop a policy and have it signed and put it up prominently so that you can show that off to the inspector, because I promise you that means a lot when you have an actual signature on a policy that talks about how important safety is. Now, if you don't have a strong functioning safety program, don't create a policy, because that's going to backfire on you, because that inspector is going to see that policy, and if you don't have everything in place, it's going to backfire and make it look like you're not being honest. But if you do have that in place, get a policy created, get it signed and hang it and show it off to the inspector. I promise that's very important. Also important to understand as part of your preparing, developing your plan, employers have rights during an enforcement action, so it's important to understand and manage those rights. So let's go ahead and talk about what those rights look like. So here are some of the employer right examples that you have during an inspection. You can request a delay to wait for, for example, if you have a safety consultant or your safety manager or the management member who is assigned to help manage the inspection, if they're not on site, you can request some time before they'll start the inspection. Typically, they'll wait 30, 45 minutes. If that person doesn't get there, they're going to start anyway, but you can request a delay for that. You must only provide the requested information and nothing more. So it's important to understand that when they ask for something, well, let me back up. Before I get into that detail, don't just hand over everything to the inspector. Only give them what they're asking for. So in other words, if you have everything consolidated in hard copy in a box, for example, or a file cabinet, don't just hand that over to them, right? You only have to provide what they're asking for and nothing more. If you don't know the answer to a question, you can request additional time to gather information. It's okay to do that. One thing that's really important to understand, you are not required to hand over past inspection reports, whether that's an internal inspection report or an external one done by your insurance company or a safety consultant or whoever. You don't have to hand those over. And the reason that's so important is if they get access to these past inspection reports and they identify hazards that you actually haven't fixed yet, that puts you at risk for willful violations that, again, can run up to $145,000. So it's really important to understand you do not have to hand over past inspection reports. Also, You can exercise some level of control over the inspector's actions and access by attempting to negotiate before the start of the inspection. So we talked previously in another video about the scope of the inspection. So for example, if it's a focused inspection, an employee complained about a specific hazard or hazards, and the inspector tells you about that, you can, for example, if that hazard is in the back of the facility by the rear door, that would be a very unique circumstance. But if it is, you don't want to walk the inspector through your entire facility. You can walk them outdoors to that back door and then directly to that hazard. You want to do that because you don't want the inspector to necessarily put his eyeballs everywhere else in your facility where he might find more violations and expand the inspection, and that could result in more citations. So you can exercise some level of control. You can try to negotiate with them. They might push back, but you have the right to at least try to do that. And then finally, a lot of companies ask and they want to know, hey, can I refuse an inspector, to enter my facility and start an inspection? You can temporarily refuse access to your company, but generally this is not a good idea. And let me explain why. If they're there, as we talked about in another video, it triggers, they're there for a reason. They're not there accidentally. They are there for a reason. And if you try to deny them access, you can do that and they'll go away, but they're going to come back more determined than ever, believing that you're trying to hide something from them. And, they might show up with more inspectors. They might expand the inspection to a comprehensive. So it's not a good idea to do that. You should give them access and go ahead and, take the medicine. The only, I think, exception to that is if there's something going on that's very unsafe in your facility that can be corrected very quickly. If that's going on, you might want to consider, refusing them access, but that would be a rare circumstance. Typically, it's just not a good idea to do that. Then also, obviously the OSHA inspector, they have rights too. And so let's talk about what some of those rights look like. They can request information on all health and safety related matters for your company. So they can ask for all the training records, all the written programs, all the health exposure test data. They can request everything other than those past inspection reports that I talked about before, which is so important to remember. They can conduct confidential employee interviews with your staff members, your managers that you can't be a part of. And this is, where they can find some really damning information about your company if you're not managing a safety program. So just be prepared for that possibility. They can and will conduct these confidential interviews to see if the employees are getting trained, to see if they know what a safety data sheet is, to see if they know what a lockout tagout procedure is, all these kinds of things. They'll find out. They can access your entire facility. I said before, you can try to negotiate access, but at the end of the day, they can access your entire facility. It's also important to understand that they must cite all identified violations. So if they see something, they have to cite it. They don't have any sort of, they can't throw something out the window just on a whim or because you ask them to. If they see it, they're going to cite it and they have to cite it. Also keep in mind that they have up to 6 months to evaluate the violations and issue citations and fines. And we're going to talk more about that in the video where we talk about what to do after an inspection. But again, that inspection ends, they have up to 6 months to actually issue the citation letter. So keep that in mind. All right, so with that said, that covers, how to prepare for an OSHA inspection. If you have any questions, make sure to post them below, or any experience dealing with this. I will definitely be on the lookout and will respond to everything. Make sure, a couple more points here, make sure to check out our next video in the series on your OSHA inspection playbook, where we're going to talk about how to actually manage an inspection. I gave you kind of a preview of how to prepare, but then we're going to talk about in detail how to actually manage an inspection if it happens. A lot more information there that you want to be aware of. Also stick around here for a moment where I'm going to make a very special offer to help you if you're worried, especially about the part about checking the status and updating your safety program, or even building a safety program from scratch. I'm going to make a very special free offer to you. And stick around for a second to hear about that. And thanks again for watching. All right, so let me begin to wrap up by asking you a very simple but also a very important question, and that's this. Are you and your company really ready if OSHA shows up tomorrow in your lobby for a surprise inspection? The fact is, if you're like most small manufacturing and industrial companies, the answer is probably no. And if that sounds like you, don't feel bad. Again, you're not alone. But the fact is, if that's the case, you are currently at major risk. The fact is that OSHA goes across the country every single day and hits small companies just like yours and issues all kinds of citations, fines, and penalties that often run into the tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you got to ask yourself, could you really afford that? So having said that, I also want to make the point that the best preparation and the best way to pass an inspection is to know and have the confidence that you have a fully functioning OSHA compliance health and safety program. I know that's easier said than done, but at this point in time, I want to make a very special, free, no obligation offer to you to help you get on track if you don't have a safety program right now. I want to offer you free enrollment in our small manufacturer safety school. So let me tell you about this program. What it does is it gives you the training, the knowledge, and the resources so you can actually start to build a customized safety program and get prepared for that inspector. So let me explain what comes with that program. It's a three-parter. Number one, we have the mini OSHA crash course designed specifically to meet the needs of small manufacturing and industrial companies. So in this free training, I'm going to walk you step by step through the process of determining which OSHA compliance requirements apply to your company and how to build that program and how to manage that program for the long term. Another really important thing to understand about this crash course, it's built for non-experts. So most of the people, most of the companies that come to us, they don't know anything about safety. So I built that program with that in mind. So even if you know nothing from safety, you'll really benefit from it. The other thing that you're going to get is an OSHA compliance check sheet. So after you watch the course, you can use this as a self-assessment, gap assessment tool to see which one of these OSHA laws applies to your company, figure out if you have it in place or not. If you don't, this document will also function as sort of a roadmap forward to get your company on the road towards compliance. The final thing that we're offering in the Small Manufacturer Safety School, I'm going to invite you to live, free, monthly training sessions where I'm going to do deep dives and cover everything that's covered in the crash course so that you can learn step-by-step instructions for actually how to build a customized safety program for your company. Again, it's free, it's no obligation, you have absolutely nothing to lose. I'm going to put a link in below the video here where you can enroll and get started immediately on your road towards compliance. I look forward to seeing you in some of those live sessions. Also, make sure to stick around for the next edition of how to pass your OSHA inspection. And finally, if you haven't already and you like what you learned today, please go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Make sure to hit that notifications bell so that you're notified every time that I upload new content, which will be 2 to 3 times per month, diving deep into the environmental health and safety regulations and issues that impact small manufacturing and industrial companies. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.